Waitress risked everything to defend the Mafia boss's daughter. What he did next stunned everyone. On a Friday night in the fall of 1974, a 22-year-old waitress named Donna Riccardi did something that every single person in that diner would remember for the rest of their lives. She stepped between two grown men, one of them armed, and refused to move, in order to protect a 15-year-old girl she had never met before that night. She had no idea, when she did it, that the girl she was shielding was the only daughter of Carmine, the Roman Esposito, a man whose name alone could empty out a city block in the neighborhoods that knew him best. She had no idea that her decision in the next 90 seconds would either get her killed or change the entire trajectory of her life. This is a true crime story about loyalty in a world built on fear, about the razor-thin line between courage and suicide, and about what happens when an ordinary person's conscience collides head-on with organized crime's oldest, coldest rule. You don't interfere in someone else's business, especially not the business of a man like Carmine Esposito. Stay with me, because what he did after that night broke every rule his own organization had lived by for 30 years. Part 1. The World Carmine. Built to understand the weight of what happened in that diner, you need to understand who Carmine Esposito actually was, and the world that produced men like him. By the mid-1970s, the American Mafia was entering what historians and federal investigators now describe as its most institutionally powerful period, right before its dramatic collapse under RICO prosecutions in the following decade. The Commission, the governing body created in the 1930s to mediate disputes between the major crime families and prevent the kind of open warfare that had defined the earlier Castellamarese War, had, by this point, overseen 4 decades of relative order among the 5 families of New York and their affiliated organizations across the country. Carmine wasn't a New York boss, but he ran one of the most profitable satellite operations tied to that world, controlling a significant slice of trucking, waste hauling, and construction material distribution across a mid-sized industrial city. Investigators who later studied his operation described it, in court documents, as a vertically integrated criminal enterprise, meaning Carmine's organization didn't just extort businesses, it owned pieces of the supply chain those businesses depended on, so that resisting him meant losing your ability to operate at all. He'd earned the nickname the Roman, not because of any connection to Italy's capital, but because of his obsession with order, hierarchy, and what he called civilization, a word he used constantly, according to people who worked for him, to describe the code of conduct he demanded from every man under him. No unnecessary violence, no touching civilians, no dragging families into business. Those weren't moral positions so much as operational ones. Historians studying organized crime's internal codes have long pointed out that rules against harming civilians and family members weren't born from tenderness, but from strategy. Random, visible violence against ordinary people brought heat, public outrage, aggressive prosecutors, front-page journalism, and eventually federal task forces. Organizations that survived for decades, rather than burning out in a few violent years, were almost always the ones that understood restraint as a survival tool, not a virtue. Carmine understood this better than almost anyone in his generation, which is exactly why what happened to his daughter terrified him more than any rival ever could have. Because for the first time in decades, someone had broken his most sacred rule, bringing a child, his child, directly into the violence. And there was no version of civilization that could explain that away. Part 2. The Girl in the Diner. Sofia Esposito was 15 years old, and by every account from people who knew the family, she had absolutely no interest in her father's business. She wanted to be a veterinarian. She spent her Saturdays volunteering at an animal shelter 2 towns over, a detail her father was fiercely, almost comically proud of, according to associates who remembered him bragging about it at social clubs where grown men usually only talked about horse races and union contracts. Carmine had made a decision, when Sofia was young, that she would grow up as close to a normal life as he could manage. She attended a Catholic girls' school under a slightly altered version of the family surname. She wasn't driven to school in one of the black Cadillacs his crew used for business. She took the bus, like everyone else, and on Friday nights, she was allowed, against the quiet objections of nearly everyone in her father's orbit, to go to the diner near her school with 2 or 3 girlfriends, unaccompanied, like any other teenager in America in 1974. This arrangement worked for years, until the night two men connected to a rival operation decided that grabbing Carmine Esposito's daughter would be the fastest possible way to force him into a negotiation he'd been refusing for months. The dispute, according to later accounts pieced together by investigators and several retired associates who spoke about it long after the fact, centered on a dockside warehouse contract that a rival faction, run by a man remembered in local lore only as Polly Cans, a nickname earned from his family's original scrap metal business, believed Carmine had taken through bribery of a city inspector. Polly's crew had tried threats through normal channels for months. Carmine, confident in his standing and unwilling to set a precedent of caving to pressure, had ignored every message. So Polly's men decided to escalate in the one way guaranteed to get Carmine's full attention immediately, by finding his daughter. Part 3. The Night at the Diner. Donna Riccardi had worked at the Sunrise Diner for just under 2 years, ever since she'd dropped out of community college to help support her mother after her father's construction accident left him unable to work. She wasn't political, wasn't connected to any of the neighborhood's criminal infrastructure, and had no idea, walking into her shift that Friday, that she was about to become part of a story that would follow her for the rest of her life. Around 9:30 that evening, two men in their 30s walked in and sat at the counter, ordering coffee they never touched. Donna would later describe, in the only interview she ever gave about that night, decades later, to a local historical society collecting oral histories of the neighborhood, that something about them felt wrong immediately. Not overtly threatening, just unnaturally still, the way men who are waiting for something specific tend to be. Sofia Esposito was in a booth near the back with two friends, laughing over milkshakes, completely unaware that she was the reason those two men were sitting at that counter. At around 10 o'clock, one of the men stood up, walked over to the booth, and told Sofia, quietly, that her father needed her outside right now. Sofia, confused but not yet frightened, because why would she be? Nothing like this had ever happened before, started to get up. Donna, who was clearing a nearby table, noticed something that Sofia's friends didn't. The man's hand was resting, just slightly too casually, against his jacket, over what would later be confirmed, in a police report Donna herself eventually filed, to be a concealed handgun. And more importantly, Donna noticed that the man calling himself a family friend didn't know Sofia's father's actual profession or real name. He referred to him, mistakenly, using a business alias Carmine hadn't used publicly in almost 8 years, which meant he wasn't a friend. He was working from outdated information his own organization had scraped together in a hurry. Donna didn't know any of the specific criminal history behind this. She just knew, instinctively, that something about this situation was catastrophically wrong, and that this 15-year-old girl was about to walk out that door with a stranger who was lying to her. So she did something that, by any rational calculation of self-preservation, she should not have done. She stepped directly between Sofia and the man, put her hand flat against his chest, and said, loud enough for the whole diner to hear, "She's not going anywhere with you." Part 4, 90 seconds. What happened over the next 90 seconds became, over the following years, one of those stories retold so many times in that neighborhood that people still argue over the exact details. But the core of it, confirmed independently by 3 different people who were in that diner that night, remained consistent. The man tried to push past Donna. She didn't move. He grabbed her arm hard enough to leave a bruise that lasted 2 weeks. She still didn't move, and instead shouted for someone, anyone, to call the police. A request that, in a neighborhood where calling the police about organized crime activity carried its own serious risks, took real nerve to make out loud in a room full of strangers. The second man, watching his partner start to lose control of a situation that was supposed to be quiet and clean, made the decision that would define everything that followed. He grabbed Donna by the shoulder and threw her backward into a table, hard enough that she hit her head on the edge of the counter and split her eyebrow open. That single act, a stranger's blood, a teenager's terror, and a room full of screaming witnesses, turned what was supposed to be a discreet extraction into an uncontrollable, public disaster. Sofia's friends were screaming. Other customers were shouting. The diner's cook, a Korean War veteran named Harold, who kept an old service revolver behind the register for exactly this kind of emergency, came around the counter with the weapon raised and ordered both men out. The 2 men fled without Sofia. The entire operation, weeks in the planning according to what later came out through informal channels within both crews, collapsed in less than 2 minutes because a 22-year-old waitress refused to let a scared teenage girl walk out a door with a liar holding a gun. Sophia, shaking, immediately called her father from the diner's payphone. And Carmine Esposito, for the first time in nearly 15 years of careful, disciplined operation, drove to a public location himself, personally, with 4 of his men, instead of sending anyone else to handle it. Part 5. The man who arrived when Carmine Esposito walked into the Sunrise Diner that night. Several longtime residents of the neighborhood later said it was the first time they'd ever seen him look genuinely frightened rather than dangerous. His daughter ran into his arms. He held her for what witnesses described as an unusually long time, silent, before he even acknowledged anyone else in the room. Then he turned to Donna Riccardi, who was sitting in a booth with a dish towel pressed to her split eyebrow, refusing the ambulance the manager had called because she didn't have insurance and was terrified of the bill. Carmen sat down across from her the same way. Years earlier and in a different city, a young woman named Renata had once sat across from a man named Salvatore, an echo of the same fundamental collision between ordinary decency and extraordinary power that keeps showing up throughout the history of organized crime, again and again, in different families, different decades, different cities. "Why did you do that?" he asked her, not as a threat, as a genuine question, from a man who spent his entire professional life calculating risk and reward, trying to understand why a stranger would take on a physical assault, potential gunfire, and unknown consequences to protect a girl she'd never met. Donna, still holding the towel to her forehead, apparently didn't fully register who she was talking to. She just said, because nobody else was going to. Part 6. The debt. Here's where this story becomes something more than just an act of courage in a diner. It becomes a case study in how organized crime's internal logic of debt and obligation actually worked in practice, a system historians and former federal investigators alike have described as functioning almost like a shadow economy of favors, every bit as binding as a written contract, and in some ways more dangerous to break. In Carmine's world, an act like Donna's created what was known informally as an open debt, a favor so significant that failing to repay it would represent a moral failure serious enough to damage a boss's standing among his own men. Everyone in that diner, and within a day, everyone connected to both crews involved in the incident, knew exactly what had happened. A civilian waitress had physically intervened to save the daughter of a major organized crime figure, at real risk to her own safety, expecting nothing in return. If Carmine did nothing, it would send a message throughout his organization that loyalty and sacrifice meant nothing to him, a catastrophic signal for a man whose entire operation depended on the loyalty of dozens of men who took daily risks on his behalf. If he overreacted with disproportionate violence against Polly Kansas' crew, he risked reigniting a war that could draw unwanted attention from a commission that, by the mid-1970s, was already nervous about the increasing aggressiveness of federal prosecutors following the passage of the RICO Act in 1970, legislation that, within a decade, would be used to systematically dismantle organized crime's leadership structures across the entire country. Carmine needed a response that was proportionate, controlled, and impossible to interpret as weakness, and according to people who later discussed it, what he did next became, in that world, a legendary example of exactly that kind of calculated, precise response. Part 7. What he did first. Quietly and without any public confrontation, Carmine's organization identified and confirmed the 2 men involved in the diner incident. Neither of them was ever seen in that city again. What exactly happened to them was never confirmed publicly, and remains, appropriately, one of the darker unresolved threads of this story. A reminder that even in a story with a genuinely warm human moment at its center, the world it happened in operated by rules that were often brutal and final. Second, and this is the part of the story that people still talk about, Carmine did not simply pay Donna off, or intimidate her into silence, or treat her like a liability to be managed, all of which would have been the easier, more typical response for a man in his position. Instead, he did something that surprised even his own closest advisors. He paid off her family's entire outstanding medical debt from her father's construction accident, a debt that, according to Donna's later recollections, had been quietly crushing her family for nearly 3 years. He arranged, anonymously at first, for a scholarship fund to cover the cost of her returning to community college, the one she'd dropped out of to support her family. And when Donna eventually pieced together, months later, exactly who had been behind these unexplained financial rescues, Carmine didn't deny it. He simply told her, in a conversation she described decades later as the strangest of her life, that some debts weren't about money at all, and that hers had already been paid the moment she stepped in front of his daughter. But the detail that made this story travel, retold in that neighborhood for years afterward, and eventually reaching the ears of the local historical society that recorded Donna's oral history decades later, was what Carmine did at Sophia's high school graduation, 3 years after the diner incident. He invited Donna, by then finishing her degree, to attend as a guest of the family, and in front of teachers, classmates, and neighborhood acquaintances who had no idea of the true history behind the invitation, Carmine Esposito, a man feared across an entire industrial corridor of that state, stood up during a private family celebration afterward and told the room, without naming names or specifics that could ever be used against him legally, that his daughter was alive and safe that night because a stranger decided that doing the right thing mattered more than staying safe. He said it was the only time in his adult life he'd witnessed real, unconditional courage from someone who had absolutely nothing to gain and everything to lose. Part 8. The complicated truth underneath the story. It would be easy to tell this story as a simple, feel-good tale about a mob boss discovering his humanity. But the true crime reality underneath it is more complicated and more honest than that. Carmine Esposito remained, until his organization was significantly weakened by federal prosecutions in the early 1980s, exactly what he had always been, a man who ran an extortion-based criminal enterprise that hurt plenty of people who were never lucky enough to receive his gratitude. Historians and investigators who've studied this era of organized crime consistently point out that acts of apparent generosity or loyalty by mob figures, however genuine in the moment, existed within, not separate from, a system built fundamentally on intimidation, extortion, and violence. Carmine's kindness toward Donna Riccardi didn't undo the damage his operation did to legitimate businesses forced to pay for protection, or the very real fear his organization instilled in an entire industrial corridor for decades. What makes this story worth telling isn't that it excuses that world. It's that it captures something true about human beings caught inside extreme systems, that even men who built empires on fear were still capable of recognizing and rewarding a version of courage they themselves had abandoned long ago in exchange for power. And that ordinary people, waitresses, cooks, bystanders with nothing to gain, were sometimes the only source of real moral clarity in rooms full of men who had spent their entire lives calculating risk instead of doing what was simply, obviously right. Donna Riccardi went on to finish her degree, and according to the same oral history project, spent over 3 decades working as a veterinary technician, a profession she said she chose partly because of a 15-year-old girl who once told her, crying in a diner booth with a split eyebrow pressed against her shoulder, that she wanted to help animals when she grew up. Sophia Esposito did, in fact, become a veterinarian. The two women, according to that same historical record, remained close friends for the rest of Donna's life. Part 9. Why this story endures. Stories like this one persist in the folklore of organized crime history for a reason that has very little to do with glamorizing violence, and everything to do with the tension at their center, ordinary decency colliding head-on with extraordinary, often terrifying power, and occasionally, against all odds, winning. Carmine Esposito spent his entire adult life building a system designed to make people afraid of him. And the moment that defined his legacy within his own world wasn't a demonstration of that fear. It was the night a 22-year-old stranger proved she wasn't afraid of anything at all, and he was left with no choice but to respect it. If this story moved you, that's exactly the kind of true crime history I bring you every week on this channel. Real accounts from the world of organized crime, the wars, the codes of silence, and the rare moments where ordinary courage changes everything. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment below telling me what you would have done if you were standing in Donna's shoes that night. And if you want to go even deeper into how debts, favors, and loyalty actually functioned inside organized crime families, check out the next video on this channel, where I break down the real history of the Commission and how 30 years of uneasy peace between America's most powerful crime families finally came apart. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.